Just as a bit of a roundup of the day and sort of next steps, where we've come with how to make a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, and where we can go.
Thank you, Val. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I'll try to keep it brief and to the point. I think I'm down in the agenda to talk about achieving the psychologically safe workplace, and I thought what I would do is to anchor my remarks around the national standard. Now, I've heard the standard mentioned several times today, and I'm assuming then that everybody knows what it is. But by a show of hands, could I see how many do know what the national standard is? Okay, so I think that's about half. So I will spend a bit of time talking about what it is, because I don't want to leave people that don't know what it is in the dark about it. But I also want to give a bit of a progress report on the national standard. First of all, I should say who I am. I'm, as you know, Martin Shane, but my background is in law and social science. And my reason for being here today, I guess, is because of my involvement in the development of the national standard. I wrote 3 of the position papers that are foundations for the standard, as it turned out. And I'm still on the technical committee that is looking at the aftershocks from the release of the standard in 2013. So, and I was a member of the expert panel that helped organizations such as Gareth's find their way through the implementation of the standard, and that was a very helpful process for not only for the people in the case study, but also for the people that developed it, because I think there's going to be another version of it before too long, based upon learnings so far. It's really hard to actually discuss psychological safety at work today without reference to the standard. A lot of work went into its development. It was a multi-stakeholder development with all the right stakeholders around the table. But as is usual with what is virtually a committee, it's a committee product. And so there are compromises were made at certain points, certain things were glossed over, certain things just never dealt with. And so it's really part of the evolution of the development of the protection of mental health in the workplace rather than the end of the story. And I think Gareth made that point too. It's a work in progress. I mean, this is something that we're not going to get done with anytime soon. So I'll use the standard as my anchor and move into talking about where the standard is at now, where it needs to be, and what we need to do to move it forward. And to cut a long story short, I'm going to end with the argument that we actually need to regulate certain aspects of the standard. Because in my view, it's just not moving fast enough, it's not digging deep enough, and it's not being taken seriously enough as a voluntary standard, which is what it is now. It's a voluntary standard within the context of occupational health and safety. But although that's how it's framed, and it's very explicitly framed in the standard as an occupational health and safety standard, it's largely gone into the workplace through the wrong door. It's gone through the HR door primarily. And what's happened in too many cases is that it's regarded as a kind of an alien object. It's regarded as a sort of an organizational threat that needs to be diffused in some way rather than something to be welcomed and implemented as it should be. So that's an unfortunate beginning in a lot of ways. What I really want to say is that the standard was intended to be, and still is, an instrument of public policy, public health policy, if you will, which is enacted through the workplace. And the goal is the reduction of the net social harm that is produced or enabled by certain ways of organizing work and managing people. So it always did have a social goal. And I'll go back to that in terms when I talk about the rationale for regulating the standard, because I think that part of the agenda has been largely forgotten. And yet when I drafted the first version of the standard in 2009, it was in two parts. One was for the workplace, one was for social policy. And the social policy thing's withered on the vine, basically. Needs to be resurrected for reasons that I'll try to explain a bit later. So in this definition, insofar as the standard tries to give shape to a vision of what I call the careful workplace, which conserves individual social and economic capital by allowing no reasonably foreseeable mental or physical harm to workers, the social bit has just dropped off and needs to be resurrected. Now, in the standard itself, there's a more specific definition, and we saw some of those earlier when Kim was talking about definitions. So the vision of the standard, and this is right on page 1 of the standard basically, is a workplace in which every practical effort is made to prevent negligent, reckless, or intentional harm to the mental health of workers. And the term negligent is in there, and one had to fight to keep it in there, because that's what establishes the floor level of care that's required to provide a psychologically safe workplace. And what it means is the term negligent in the law is connected to the prevention of reasonably foreseeable harm. So that's really where the floor standard is. Now, that floor standard is actually higher than the common law in Ontario. It's not higher than the common law in BC. But across the country, there's a huge variations, and basically what the standard tries to do is elevate the standard to this level of the prevention of reasonably foreseeable harm. Now, the harm that we're talking about here is not of a trivial nature. It does refer to significant damage that incapacitates a worker in the short or long run, and we call this mental injury. Now, mental injury, I think, is also a term that needs to be out in the lexicon, and didn't want to take up time earlier to say that, but I think that, when you're working on definitions, that this is one that needs to be out there, at least for purposes of discussion. I'm not sure we'll find this consensus on it at any time soon, but basically, mental injury is the result of acts or omissions of people in the workplace. It's not something that happens by accident. It happens through negligence, recklessness, or intentionality. So, in order to fulfill the vision of the standard, what's required are three things, and I was fascinated to hear Gareth refer to all three of them, and you've done my work for me, basically. But they're governance philosophy, a management system, and a cultural design. And basically, the governance philosophy is really a declared vision of how the workplace should be run, based on the recognition that how we behave toward one another in the workplace affects our mental health in significant ways. And that sort of a basic acknowledgement of that is the building block for the governance philosophy. And then beyond building on that is the commitment to create what we might call the careful workplace. We don't see that very often, and it's the piece that's most glaringly, obviously missing in a lot of attempts to implement the standard currently. What we do have typically is the management system, which is the backbone of the thing. When you actually read the standard, that's what it really describes, is the management system. It's the it's the plan, do, check, act sort of bits of it that are framed as a management system that looks like a lot of other management systems that Canadian Standards Association would have developed and implemented over the many years of their existence. This, of course, is, by the way, is their first venture into the softer areas of occupational health and safety, and I certainly applaud them for their courage in taking it on, because this is the first time that an organisation like that has said we really need that there's enough information and data to go on to frame the protection of psychological safety, psychological health, as an appropriate topic for occupational health and safety. The third element is cultural design, and again, Gareth referred to that, which is a deliberately promoted set of integrated values, beliefs, and attitudes and practices that are wrapped around the notion that the way we behave toward one another in the workplace affects our mental health. So the governance philosophy is more than a political statement. It's actually what will drive the cultural change. And because that's missing, then the cultural change is frequently missing. There are 4 basic understandings or assumptions that drive the standard that I would imagine very few people that have implemented the standard could articulate even to this day, because it's been treated so much as a sort of a checklist, let's do this and get on with it kind of thing. And one of them is the one that I've already mentioned, that mental health is strongly influenced by the way we behave toward one another in the workplace. And we have a shared duty to prevent harm to one another's mental health. The standard's predicated on the belief that there are certain basic human needs that can and must be met at work in order to support mental health and not to put it at risk. So the most basic of those needs is, after the need for physical safety, are for fairness or justice and dignity or self-worth. And when those very basic needs are not met, then over time their frustration can turn into risks to health, productivity, and even corporate liability. So those are the understandings that must percolate into the governance and management philosophy and practice. And as I say, they really haven't. So basically the standard is about, and this is what the management system part of it is wrapped around, is to assess and address risks to mental health that arise from certain ways in which work is organized and people are managed. That's it in a nutshell, basically. It broadly talks about a psychologically safe culture, but it doesn't basically say how to get there. So that's sort of it. We left off where we really should have continued. Now, the kind of assessment that's being discussed in the standard are 100% aligned with the kind of assessment that John and Terry were talking about this morning, and I want to emphasize that. But as Terry said too, there's lots of different ways of feeding the birds in this particular case. So that's not the only game in town, but it also it's got all the bits. So I mean, it is exemplary. The standard itself refers a lot to guarding minds at work, and since it's been introduced, I'm glad to say that the committee the technical committee has sort of backed off of that, because they've been challenged on it. I mean, basically people have said, well, we've got these surveys already, can't we repurpose them to direct toward the kind of issues you want us to look at? And in some cases you can. In other cases, there are, of course, whole other concepts like the mental injury toolkit that can just as easily be planted in the standard framework and do very well. One thing I would say about assessment, though, is that it requires a lot of preparation in the governance department, and it calls for maximum participation of workers at all levels. So unfortunately, what we get in too many cases, and I hate to be negative about this, because really this is very close to my heart, this stuff, but there's a lot of fake participation going on out there. And sorry, Mr. Trump, but if there really is, I mean, a lot of it's lip service to engaging the people that need to be engaged, which is everyone. and they need to stay engaged, and they need to be engaged in more than a peremptory sort of superficial sort of way. So when you look at what the management system as a schematic, then the survey methodology part is quite a ways in, and what we need to spend a lot of time on, and it sounds like CCOHS spent quite a bit of time on this front end part, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So we need to spend a lot more time. In fact, when people say, when are we doing the standard, I'd say you're doing the standard when you're doing this. That can take up to 2-3 years sometimes to get an organization turned around enough that it can actually go about the process of gathering data and analyzing data without actually causing a backlash within the workforce that basically is based on a suspicion about why you're doing this in the first place. So a lot more work needs to be done at these levels. And we need to remind ourselves too, with regard to assessment, that the purpose of assessment is the identification of situations and psychosocial environments that have a high probability of giving rise to mental injury. So it's not a hunt for perpetrators and victims, and it's got nothing to do with identifying the mentally ill or anything like that. It's got to do with situations or work environments. And again, I'm not so sure whether going in, a lot of organizations understand that. So the sort of, you might sort of ask at some, and people do ask, well, what's the added value of the standard when we've got things like Bill 168 and 132, and now we've got, was it 127, isn't it, the new workers' comp? As Terry was saying this morning, you know, we seem to have the sort of the building blocks in terms of legislative readiness to do this stuff. I think the added value here is that the standard really directs our attention toward behaviors in the workplace. I call them the 10 early indicators that have the potential for mental injury when it's allowed to go on and unchecked. It's mostly negligent stuff. You can also, at its lowest level, you can call it careless behavior, but negligent brings it into the area of legally prohibited. A lot of these things by themselves wouldn't in themselves create mental injury, but cumulatively some of them do. Expecting too much of workers with no heed to the consequences, that's a pretty good candidate. Withholding discretion over how work is done where no business rationale exists. I won't go through the list, but you get the idea. I mean, these are things that go on in a lot of workplaces, and they're not instantly recognizable as psychotoxic or dangerous situations, except that when they go on for a long time and they're cumulative. I mean, these are the ones that we more typically recognize, and to some extent are dealt with by the law, although not so much at a preventive level. I think both 168 and 132 have sort of missed opportunities for taking a deeper dive on this, which is why I think that we need to think about more regulation in terms of the front end of the preventive spectrum. I won't spend long on culture because it's a subject that could occupy a long time and should occupy a long time, but not today. And I think one of the things that going into the implementation of the standard that a lot of people don't even have at their command is a definition of what culture is. So that and people are talking about different things when they talk about culture. This term here is a fairly standard sociological definition that's been around for a while, a set of values, meanings and understandings and practices that are shared by a stable group or community. And one of the key aspects of culture is language. And we've talked about that quite a bit. And I applaud the efforts of the partners to elevate the use of language in a consistent, comprehensive sort of way. I think it's a terrific vehicle for that. But that has to happen within individual workplaces as well as at the level that Kim was talking about. So, I mean, it may be trite to say this, but language is conduct. I mean, certainly you can recognize that in terms of abusive conduct, but it's also abusive language, I mean. But it's certainly, I think, directs us toward the idea that having a shared language is job one in changing cultures, and it's one of our biggest challenges. I've played with a basic language of carefulness, which is really a sort of more a lay concept of the legal concept of negligence. And it's like the opposite of negligence. So carefulness is making every reasonable effort to be aware of how our conduct affects others and understand some basic things about their rights, needs, and interests. So it reflects an attitude of vigilance and a desire to be aware of the consequences of our acts and omissions. Now, we need cultural vehicles to do that, and we don't have them. The one that I've been working on for years without much success is the concept of the neighbor at work, which is a sort of a symbol for the careful person at work. But lately it has actually gotten more traction than in the last year. It's gotten more traction than it has in the last 25 years, and it's interesting that might actually be an attractive concept to at least wrap our discussions around, whether we end up using the language or not. So language is the building block for culture, a building block for culture. And again, as speakers earlier have said, and Terry in particular, the essence of carefulness is fairness. I won't go into the different kinds of fairness and so forth, but this one actually is this definition, the fairness is the perception that our basic needs, interests, and rights are being recognized and accommodated up to a reasonable standard by others in our circle of influence, is actually based upon the seminal work of some legal scholars and philosophers, John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin in particular. So it's not an airy-fairy sort of notion. It is actually rooted in legal thinking, and if adopted, would actually provide a legal foundation for carefulness in the workplace. But I've basically, now you've seen the vision, and I've already talked a bit about how that vision has not been fulfilled. There are some notable exceptions out there. But as I said, I think the standard's been treated a bit as a virus that needs to be contained in too many cases, or at best as a checklist exercise. And there isn't any real recognition of the intended social agenda of the standard. So there's no social or public policy to enable that to occur. So ultimately, this is how we come to the case for regulation. And I would like to, I think I've got time to go through the 10 points, and then I'm nearly done. And the first one is, first of all, I should say what I mean by regulation. I'm not talking about regulating the whole standard. I'm talking about the assessment part of it. So I drafted a regulation in my book called The Careful Workplace, and it's called Assessment and Abatement of Psychosocial Risks in the Workplace. And there I do use the term psychosocial rather than psychological. So basically it calls for the use of assessments of the kind we talked about on a routine basis. That's the sort of thing that inspectors could direct their attention to. Well, have you done it and how well have you done it? Have you established some things that I call risk reduction targets? So if you've established that there is a concern about certain things going on in the workplace, you have to establish goals to reduce those risk factors. And there are alert thresholds. So those would be where more than 20, in this draft, where more than 20% of the workforce say there's a serious concern about a certain stress or psychosocial factor, whether it's demand, control, effort, reward, fairness, whatever. Not very dissimilar from the approach that's been taken in many parts of Europe, including the UK, but also including Denmark, which actually has a legislative framework for this. So inspectors can go out with some authority and check what's being done. We don't have that. I believe we need that. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about assessment. So why would we do that? Well, from an employer's point of view, losses to employers due to what we've called mental injury are assessed somewhere between a quarter and a third of all corporate costs related to mental disability, making it one of the most expensive unfunded liabilities facing them. So what regulation would do is it would constrain employers to confront that risk, ultimately to their own advantage, but also to that of society at large, which currently bears the burden of the fallout from workplace mental injuries. That's number one. The second point related to the social burden is that the incidence of workplace mental injury, I mean, how much of it's going on, is such that losses to society associated with it have been estimated at somewhere between 1% and 3% of gross domestic product. Now, these are European estimates, but they coincide eerily with estimates of the total losses in Canada. That makes, to my mind, I don't think I'm alone in this, but it makes it a population health issue, a public policy issue. This is a public policy area in my view. So that was the original intent of the standard. It was to reduce the social costs of mental injury generated by the workplace and to increase the social benefits arising from effective mental health protection. So regulation at provincial and federal levels is required in order to advance the public policy agenda of the standard in any meaningful way. So the third point is that the progress toward implementation of the standard on a voluntary basis is very slow. I've made already reference to that, and it's going to take us decades to achieve the level of penetration necessary to have population health effects. And that, the fourth point is that pace is inconsistent with the seriousness of the issue. And regulation would speed up that pace, hopefully. Now, the fifth point is that workers' compensation legislative and policy changes and recent awards are now, and particularly Bill 127, which you've heard about today, and if you didn't already know about it, which basically creates an opportunity to provide compensation for chronic stress under certain conditions. That is going to put a huge back pressure on the front end of the system to prevent mental injury. Because if you're compensating at this end of the system, you're going to be paying a lot of money out for that kind of stuff, depending on how it actually comes out in the end. It hasn't broken the bank in BC yet, but there are many concerns about it that in fact, if that's the end, if you're going to do end-of-pipe solutions like that, you're going to pay a lot of money. So, mind you, Victoria still does put its sewage out into the ocean, so I guess. But they're trying to amend that situation. So wouldn't it make sense to shore up the front end of the system to prevent mental injury, and wouldn't regulation help with that? I mean, it's a question. It's not. I'm not insisting that's the answer. I'm just putting it out there for for further discussion. Seventh point is that prevention of reasonably foreseeable mental injuries should occur as a matter of right, and it shouldn't be seen as a kind of benefit that can be withdrawn at will. Regulation would unequivocally locate prevention of mental injury in an occupational health and safety legal framework rather than in an HR framework, and it would establish, it would land protection of mental health in the rights area as opposed to the benefits area. So the eighth point is that the right to a system of work free of reasonably foreseeable harm to mental health is a reflection of a duty to protect mental health by all reasonable means. And once it's embedded in regulation, I think it would take the conversation out of this framework of, well, what's going to be my return on investment if I do this? Wrong question. This is not nice to do. This is something we got to do, I would argue. And it's fair enough to talk about value for money when you're investing in stuff like this, but it's not, you wouldn't ask that question about, well, you know, what's my return on investment if I provide safety helmets? You know, wrong question. So the same consideration should apply in the area of safety hats for the mind, I guess. The ninth point is that implementation of the standard, if it's going to really happen, needs to be monitored at the board level and the governance level of an organization, whatever that level is. That's not happening in any consistent way. And regulation would probably have the impact of putting protection of mental health in the workplace on the corporate risk register, so that it has to be taken seriously in the AGM, and accountability should be required for it. A related point is that, and this is a very important one, I've seen this happen, unfortunately, several times during the last 4 years, is that one CEO can be really enthusiastic about bringing the standard in and get halfway to it and then goes. And the next one comes in and says, oh, we trash that. Literally, and this has happened in the healthcare sector 4 times to my knowledge across the country. I think regulation, at least, you know, I mean, this has to be done at a provincial level. Each province has to do this. It would actually prevent that from happening to the extent that it's happening anyway. And lastly, I think that regulation would require the allocation of resources to the implementation of the standard. A lot of even HR people, when polled on this topic, say, well, we would like to have it regulated, not only because it puts it in somebody else's basket, but also because, you know, we only do things that are legislatively required. So, you know, if you assign resources to it, we'll do it. And otherwise, you know, it's an elastic kind of thing. We'll do it if we have time, or we'll do it if we have the inclination. So that's basically the last part of the argument, I think. So that's it, basically. I think that we need to think seriously about you know, the 10 points that I've raised, and maybe others as well. I know there's going to be a lively debate about it, because even within the technical committee that developed this thing, there was a lot of resistance to thinking about regulation. And yet, you know, 4 years down the road, although we can make a big fuss about, you know, how well the standard is being implemented, how many times it's been downloaded, which I think is about 35,000 times. You know, I don't know what the standard's being used for. It might be used as a booster seat for all I know. I mean, it's out there, but it's not necessarily being, you know, taken as seriously as it should. Very good beginning, a very good start, and this is part of the evolution of the idea that the protection of mental health should be part of the occupational health and safety framework, which is where I think the law is pushing it. But I think that we need to push harder. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Okay.
That's an excellent question to which I have no adequate answer. The only perspective I have on that is at a team level where you've got multi-generations involved, including millennials. And I've seen that happen where I think the challenge to a team that's multi-generational is to find some way of find some common ground, and I think that can be done. I suppose that can be done through non-traditional means. But I mean, I think probably it's best done in a live environment. I mean, it's very hard to ask. For you to ask me and me to ask you in a team setting, well, what is it you think you owe me and what do I think I owe you as, let's use this symbol, the neighbor at work. You know, how careful do I have to be of you? I mean, I don't even know anything about you. You don't know anything about me. So how can I be careful of you? And if you say, well, I can do that, you know, we can do that electronically or something like that, I'm not sure that this may not be area where you can do that. I'm not sure though. I mean, I mean, in experiments that I've been part of, they've all been live. But I did work with one company that now defunct, but it's not my fault. That had an international reach, and so they were doing sort of virtual meetings on the phone. And with visual aids as well. I mean, those things are getting more and more sophisticated. So it's possible to do that. I mean, my daughter does that from home. I mean, she's a leader of an international team, and she has meetings. She's sitting in her own home. Now, it's increasingly possible to have this kind of conversation by that means. But I mean, it wouldn't be comfortable for me because, God, I'm not even a boomer. I'm before the Big Bang. You know, I mean, it's so. I mean, I'm not the right person to ask probably about that. But I mean, my inclination is to say let's try to keep it live as long as we can, unless we have to go to some other means of doing it. Because if we go to some other means of doing it, I think we're going to have some real challenges in how effective that's going to be. But you know, maybe it's achievable. I hope it is. It's a great question, though. Thanks very much for that.
Any other questions? On the computer? So this is someone suggesting that we should actually have a DVD or something like that people could review and share with others trying to cope with their mental health, and saying thanks, waited for many years for an event like this. So you're welcome, I guess, is the first answer, but certainly this is the first of many of these types of events that we hope to hold, and also the system is responding in terms of, we've already heard about the resources that the individual organizations have and are offering, but there will be a coordinated website led by WSPS, but that all of the system partners will be involved in the editorial board, I guess we would call it, of filling the website, and that should be available by the end of May, actually. Thank you very much, Martin. We really appreciate it.